Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really dynamic and critical area, this intricate technological tug of war between the US and China.
Right.
And we're specifically zeroing in on semiconductors and the absolutely vital position Taiwan holds in this, well, global chess game.
It's a fundamental landscape to grasp, definitely. I mean, we're talking about the core technology powering pretty much everything now.
Exactly, from our phones to, advanced military systems.
Then Taiwan is right there, smack in the middle of this high-stakes competition.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener, who wants to get up to speed on this smartly and efficiently, we're really committed to cutting through the technical jargon and just delivering the crucial insights.
Yeah, getting straight to the point.
We're focusing on those leading-edge chips, the ones under 7 nanometers. Now, these aren't your average circuits.
Not at all.
They are the essential engines driving AI breakthroughs, the expansion of 5G, and, cutting-edge military applications. This really places Taiwan in a central geopolitical role, doesn't it?
It really does.
What's fascinating right off the bat, though, is how that initial U.S.-China trade war had a kind of unexpected ripple effect on Taiwan's semiconductor sector.
Indeed. It seems like the initial assumptions about the trade war's impact on Taiwan were a bit off the mark. A surprising outcome, really.
That's right. I mean, the initial thinking was that the U.S.-China trade war, with all those tariffs on Chinese semiconductor exports, would probably hurt Taiwan.
You'd think so.
But what actually happened was quite the opposite. Because of those U.S. tariffs on China, a significant chunk of semiconductor orders actually shifted towards Taiwan, leading to a pretty substantial boom for their industry. It's a good reminder that international trade can have some, unpredictable consequences.
An unintended consequence, definitely. But this surge in demand didn't go unnoticed, right? And the U.S. subsequently introduced a strategic response, the CHIPS and Science Act.
Right, the CHIPS Act.
And this represents a really significant shift in U.S. industrial policy, moving away from a purely market-driven approach to, directly intervening in a critical strategic sector.
It's like a recognition that globalization has its limits in this kind of charged geopolitical environment.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack the CHIPS and Science Act then. What's the fundamental idea driving it?
Well, the primary objective is quite straightforward. It's really about slowing down China's advancement in the semiconductor arena.
Okay, how?
It aims to do this by offering pretty substantial financial incentives, tax breaks too, to semiconductor companies that are willing to invest and build facilities within the United States.
So basically trying to get them to build on U.S. soil.
Exactly. The core strategy is, in essence, to encourage these key players to align more closely with U.S. technological and, strategic objectives.
So the U.S. was essentially saying, come build here, be part of our team. But then there was a development that seemed to really ramp up the concern in the U.S.
Right. U.S. anxieties were significantly amplified when Chinese firms reportedly announced they had successfully developed 7-nanometer chips.
Oh, okay. That was earlier than expected.
It surprised many observers, yes. It suggested that China's progress in advanced semiconductor manufacturing might be accelerating faster than people previously anticipated.
This is where things take a really interesting turn. Because like we said, these 7-nanometer chips, and maybe even more so the next-gen stuff like 5 millimeters, are absolutely critical. Why did that 7-nanometer news cause such a stir?
Well, these cutting-edge chips are just the bedrock of next-generation technologies. We're talking about AI evolution, realizing 5G's full potential, and crucially, the sophistication of advanced military hardware.
So being able to make them independently is a huge deal.
It's widely seen as a key to future technological and maybe even military dominance. So naturally, this realization led to the U.S. intensifying its technology control measures.
And those measures have big implications for Taiwan.
Significant ramifications, yes.
So Taiwan suddenly finds itself in this incredibly strategic, almost pivotal position. And to understand why, we need to maybe look back a bit at how the industry was historically structured.
Exactly. Historically, there was a pretty distinct division of labor. The United States largely concentrated on the higher profit segments, like integrated circuit design.
IC design, right? The brains of the chip.
Yes. And they strategically shifted the sort of lower value activities like foundry work, which is the actual manufacturing.
Building the factories, making the chips.
Right. And also the crucial steps of packaging and testing. Those were largely moved to locations in Asia.
Makes sense. Focus on the IP and design, outsource the capital-intensive manufacturing. But then the global landscape started to shift, didn't it?
It did. The COVID-19 pandemic and the escalating U.S.-China trade war really exposed vulnerabilities in these complex global supply chains.
Cause a lot of disruption.
Significant disruptions, yeah, and financial harm to many companies. It really highlighted the risks of being over-reliant on, geographically concentrated manufacturing.
And then you had China's SMIC making that, well, rather bold claim about getting to sub-7 nanometer processes without needing EUV equipment.
Extreme ultraviolet lithography, yeah.
Which, as we heard, really set off alarm bells in the U.S. I mean, EUV is like the most advanced printer for these tiny circuits, right?
That's a good way to put it. Without it, making the most cutting-edge chips is significantly harder.
So SMIC claiming they could do it without EUV was the same.
Very. And what's particularly noteworthy is the U.S. response. The CHIPS Act isn't just about bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.
No.
It's also strategically designed to attract investment from key Asian players, especially Taiwan, to the United States. The clear underlying goal is to curb China's rapid progress in this critical tech domain.
So what's the current picture? What's the U.S. share of global semiconductor manufacturing now?
Currently, the U.S. accounts for a relatively modest slice, maybe around 8%.
Only 8%?
Yeah. Projections after the CHIPS Act kicks in aim to increase that to perhaps 12%. But a notable success for the U.S. have been getting commitments from major players like Taiwan's TSMC and South Korea's Samsung.
To build new fabs in the U.S.?
Exactly. Advanced manufacturing facilities in the U.S. alongside Intel's own expanded domestic investments.
Okay, so the U.S. is definitely trying to boost its own capabilities. But where does Taiwan really shine in this whole global ecosystem? What are their core strengths?
Taiwan's strengths are truly remarkable. They dominate in foundry services, that manufacturing piece accounting for over 60% of global output.
Over 60%.
And when you look specifically at the most advanced, high-end processes, their share jumps to over 70%.
Wow. How did that happen?
Well, it wasn't accidental. Decades of focused government investment building up a highly skilled engineering workforce. It created this, near monopoly in advanced foundry.
And it's not just manufacturing, right?
No, beyond just making the chips, Taiwan also has significant capabilities in IC design and also in those crucial areas of advanced packaging and testing.
So they're deeply involved across multiple critical stages. How do other key regions fit into this picture? Like the U.S., Europe, Japan, Korea?
It's a deeply interconnected global ecosystem. The U.S. is still a powerhouse in IC design, intellectual property, IP, certain types of equipment for IDMs.
IDMs being companies that do everything design and manufacture.
Right. Unlike pure-play foundries, the U.S. is also strong in EDA tools, the software used to design chips. Europe has strengths in specialized equipment, most famously the Dutch company ASML.
The EUV guys.
Exactly, making those critical EUV machines. Japan is a leader in supplying essential raw materials and some specialized equipment.
And Korea.
South Korea is a major force in memory chips. DRAM and NAND flash, mainly serving the consumer electronics market.
And Taiwan sits as the leader in foundry for these high-end applications.
Undisputed leader, especially for things like AI, high-performance computing, 5G.
It sounds like a really delicate web of interdependencies. What about Taiwan's access to the stuff they need, and where do their chips go?
That's a crucial point. While Taiwan is a manufacturing giant, it heavily relies on Europe, the U.S., and Japan for essential raw materials, intellectual property, and those vital EDA design tools.
So they need inputs from others.
Definitely. And at the same time, Taiwan can't ignore the huge demand coming from mainland China. China imports roughly 80% of the world's semiconductor production.
80%? That's enormous.
It's a market valued at around $150 billion annually. Just colossal.
Let's really try to grasp the significance of this industry for Taiwan itself. How big of an impact does it have on their economy?
Oh, it's absolutely central. The semiconductor industry provides something like 20% of the manufacturing sector's jobs.
1 in 5 manufacturing jobs.
Yeah. And in 2021, it accounted for a staggering 34.8% of Taiwan's total exports.
Over a third.
And even more impressive, maybe, is that it accounted for 70% of their total trade surplus.
70%. So it's hugely important for their economic security.
Absolutely. These companies are often seen as, vital national assets.
You mentioned South Korea earlier. How does their situation compare? They're big in chips, too.
It's an interesting contrast. Both are major players, of course. But South Korea's industry, focusing heavily on DRAM and NAND flash for consumer electronics, has actually recently shifted from having a trade surplus to a deficit with mainland China.
Really? Why is that?
Complex reasons, market shifts, perhaps China developing its own memory capacity. But it's had broader economic repercussions for South Korea trade balance issues. currency depreciation.
And Taiwan?
Taiwan, with its emphasis on those high-end chips for AI, 5G, HPC, plus more mature tech, has maintained a more robust position so far, keeping that large trade surplus.
And just to really hammer home Taiwan's critical importance, especially in this U.S.-China tech rivalry.
Well, Taiwan's dominance in producing those crucial sub-7mm chips, over 60% of the global market share, you just can't overstate it.
Because those are the key chips for the future.
Exactly. Given that 5mm and now 3nm chips are seen as foundational for future military dominance, the nation controlling their manufacture holds significant strategic leverage.
And it's all connected.
It's a highly interconnected ecosystem, yeah. Relies on Japanese materials, Dutch ASML equipment, U.S. applied materials, and Taiwanese manufacturers like TSMC to actually make it all work.
Okay. So with that picture of Taiwan's pivotal role, let's dive into how these U.S. policies, the CHIPS Act, and this idea of a Chip 4 alliance are actually impacting them.
Right. The U.S. is pursuing this dual strategy, as you said. The CHIPS Act and this envisioned Chip 4 alliance. Both are fundamentally designed to constrain China's rapid rise in semiconductors.
Let's break down the financial muscle behind the CHIPS Act first. What kind of money are we talking about?
It's significant. The act allocates about $52 billion in direct subsidies for companies investing in production and research in the U.S.
$52 billion. Wow.
Plus around $24 billion in tax credits over 4 years. And then there's another huge chunk, $200 billion, earmarked for broader scientific R&D over the next decade, all aimed at boosting U.S. competitiveness against China.
That's a massive financial commitment, but there have to be strings attached to getting that money, right? Companies don't just get free cash.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A key condition for companies taking these U.S. subsidies is a 10-year restriction.
Okay, a restriction on what?
On making new investments or significantly expanding their existing advanced semiconductor manufacturing, specifically anything below the 28nm level in China.
So if you take U.S. money, you can't build advanced fabs in China for a decade.
Pretty much.
And China, I imagine, wasn't too happy about that. Did they respond?
Indeed. China reportedly proposed that companies accepting U.S. subsidies would also face restrictions on investing or expanding their operations within China.
So trying to counter-pressure them.
Exactly. It just highlights the intense geopolitical squeeze these manufacturers are in Taiwan, Korea, even U.S. companies. They're being forced to make really difficult choices, potentially sacrificing market access.
It really puts them between a rock and a hard place. What's the bigger strategic goal for the U.S. in pushing for this localization, bringing chip production home?
It's driven by a couple of key things. First, those supply chain disruptions during COVID really drove home the fragility of these global networks.
Right, the shortages were painful.
Very. And second, the rising geopolitical tensions, especially with China, have raised serious worries about the security and reliability of supply for these critical components, particularly for high-tech and defense industries.
We've heard about TSMC and Samsung investing big in the U.S. Are there other examples of this onshoring push?
Yeah, the trend is quite clear. Beyond TSMC and Intel in Arizona and Samsung in Texas, we're seeing other moves. Micron is investing heavily in the U.S. for advanced memory chips.
Okay.
Taiwan's Global Wafers is building a silicon wafer plant in Texas, and companies like Qualcomm and Grosvenor are expanding semiconductor-related production and investments in places like New York.
What are the main advantages for these companies making these big U.S. investments? Why do it?
Several key benefits. Being closer to their major customers, especially those big U.S. IC design firms, is a major plus.
Shorter supply lines, easier collaboration.
Exactly. It also helps them get ahead of potential future U.S. restrictions on technology and equipment exports. Ultimately, it's about building a more secure, resilient supply chain for these critical leading-edge chips.
So the CHIPS Act is clearly a massive policy lever. What about its intended effect on China's own semiconductor goals?
Well, primary aim is definitely to directly slow down China's progress in advanced semiconductor manufacturing. The U.S. government got particularly concerned after that Spec 7nm claim.
Right.
So consequently, we're seeing a tightening of U.S. export controls on semiconductor tech and related equipment going to China. And these controls are expected to get even stricter.
How so?
Potentially expanding the restrictions from the current, say, 10nm level down to 14nm, making it harder for China to access slightly less advanced but still important technology.
And this leads us to that Chip 4 alliance idea. What's the basic concept there?
The Chip 4 alliance involving the U.S., Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea is envisioned as this powerful coalition. Potentially, it could exert control over the export of advanced semiconductor processes, the equipment needed, the software, critical components, basically coordinating restrictions on exports to China in the future.
So a coordinated tech containment effort.
That seems to be the idea. It would significantly widen the existing technological gap if fully implemented.
What do you see as the likely long-term consequences of all these U.S. policies? Where is this heading?
Well, the likely long-term trend seems to be a decentralization of semiconductor manufacturing by allied nations, diversifying production.
Not just advanced chips.
No, encompassing advanced processes, but also diversifying where mature process production happens, reducing over-reliance on any single region, especially China. This shift is kind of being seen as the new normal now.
This whole restructuring of global supply chains sounds incredibly complex.
It is, massively. Analysis has highlighted how companies not just in semiconductors, but across ICT and even advanced batteries, need to proactively look for alternative sourcing, reduce their dependence on China, and maybe even bring vendors closer to home markets. Repatriation, reshoring, friendshoring, all those terms.
Given all this pressure, Taiwan is really in a delicate spot, isn't it?
Absolutely critical position. Semiconductor production is so vital to their economy, and TSMC is often viewed as like a national protector, the Silicon Shield.
So the government needs solid policies.
Essential for Taiwan's government to have clear, robust policies to navigate pressure from both the U.S. and China. Needs proactive strategy, collaboration between research bodies and the manufacturers themselves.
We've talked CHIPS Act, potential Chip 4. Let's dig into these expanded U.S. tech controls on China more. It sounds like they've gotten quite broad.
Yes, the U.S. has definitely moved beyond targeting just specific companies. The restrictions now cover technology, equipment, applications, even talent flow. It's aiming for a pretty comprehensive containment of China's semiconductor ambitions.
Can you give some specific examples of these controls? What exactly is being restricted?
Sure. First, there are tighter licensing rules for exporting advanced logic chips. Basically anything below 16 millimeter. Certain memory chips too, like DRAM below 18 millimeters and NAND flash over 128 layers, plus the tech to make them, all go into China.
Okay, so restricting the most advanced stuff.
Yes. Second, controls on exporting supercomputer technology and related applications that exceed certain high-performance computing power thresholds within China.
Got it.
And maybe most significantly, restrictions on U.S. persons, citizens, and green card holders, preventing them from supporting chip development or production at Chinese semiconductor fabs.
Wow, restricting people.
Yes, and it goes further. Chinese individuals with U.S. citizenship or green cards returning to work in China's semiconductor industry face a stark choice. Give up their U.S. status or leave their job in China.
That's intense. Those talent restrictions could have a huge long-term impact.
Potentially very significant, yes. Brain drain, slowing down development.
So what are the specific impacts of all these regulations on Taiwan's own semiconductor industry?
It's multifaceted, hits different parts differently. For Taiwanese equipment companies like FIDI or MarketTech, maybe a moderate revenue hit, perhaps 5–8%.
Okay.
But for IC design houses, companies like L-Chip or Global Unichip, the impact is likely much bigger. They rely more on the Chinese market, so maybe at least a 30% revenue reduction for them.
Ouch. What about packaging?
Packaging and carrier board firms like AOC or UA Micron, probably a smaller impact, likely under 5%.
In the big foundries, TSMC, UMC.
For foundries, it depends on their tech focus. Advanced process leaders like TSMC, the direct hit is maybe over 5%, mostly impacting revenue from their fabs in China, which is currently about 10% of their total.
Okay, so a noticeable hit, but maybe manageable directly.
Directly, perhaps. But for companies focused on more mature processes, UMC, LMC, VIS, the short-term impact might be limited. However, there's a long-term risk of being crowded out as China inevitably puts more resources into developing its own mature process manufacturing capabilities to compensate for being cut off from the advanced stuff.
Right. China will double down where it can. And it's not just TSMC's direct China revenue that's affected, is it? There are knock-on effects.
That's exactly right. There's an indirect impact, too. TSMC makes chips for other companies, right? Their OEM clients like AMD, NVIDIA.
The big U.S. chip designers.
Yes. They will likely see their revenue from the Chinese market shrink because of these U.S. restrictions. And if they sell less in China, they order fewer chips from TSMC. So it ripples through.
It really does ripple through the whole ecosystem. So what are the broader consequences for Taiwan's economy overall, given how huge this sector is for them?
Well, given semiconductors' immense importance manufacturing exports, that massive trade surplus, any major disruption hits Taiwan hard. The recent boom was already cooling down a bit.
And these policies accelerate that cooling.
They likely exacerbate it, yes. Taiwan finds itself, yet again, at the center of major geopolitical tension. This leads to louder calls, both internally and externally, for risk diversification.
Meaning setting up factories overseas.
Exactly. Plus, you have that growing competition from China in mature processes, adding another layer of challenge. All these factors could negatively impact Taiwan's exports, its trade surplus, currency stability, foreign investment, maybe even risk some existing foreign investment pulling out.
It paints a picture of really significant challenges and highlights the need for Taiwan to navigate this very carefully. You mentioned a de-China policy. What does that really mean here?
Well, the fundamental goal of the U.S. policies really is to force major semiconductor players to choose a side, use restrictions and incentives to slow China's advanced tech progress, and maintain U.S. leadership, especially in areas key to military power, AI, 5G, and so on.
But for Taiwan, it's obviously not that simple, just picking a side.
Absolutely not. It's a deeply complex reality for Taiwan. The U.S. is a vital ally, a key source of tech and IP. But mainland China is this massive critical market for Taiwanese chips.
Can't ignore either one.
And they also rely on Japan, the Netherlands, for essential materials and equipment. It's an incredibly delicate balancing act. South Korean manufacturers are in a very similar difficult position too.
And the reach of U.S. policy keeps expanding, it seems.
Yes, the U.S. is increasingly using what's called long-arm jurisdiction, now requiring export permits for tech below 16 nanometer going to China, and those restrictions we talked about on U.S. green card holders and senior roles at Chinese chip firms.
Right.
Plus, the U.S. is actively promoting strategies like ABC anywhere but China, and China plus one, China plus N, all pushing for alternative production locations outside mainland China.
Okay, so given this really complex, shifting landscape, what are some of the strategies Taiwan might need to adopt? How can they respond effectively?
Taiwan really needs a multi-pronged, adaptive approach. For a giant like TSMC strategically investing in fabs in Europe, the U.S., Japan becomes increasingly important.
Why? What are the drivers for that?
Several reasons. Accessing subsidies offered by those regions, potentially avoiding anti-dumping duties down the line, being physically closer to major customers, like those U.S. design houses, spreading geopolitical risk.
Not having all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also, frankly, alleviating domestic resource constraints in Taiwan core. Water, power, land, labor, talent are all tight.
Makes sense.
Plus, TSMC is positioning itself as this reliable global supplier, a good citizen of the industry, committed to supplying chips for key sectors like automotive, AI, 5G.
We've also seen Taiwan trying hard to engage in international economic groups, right?
Yes. Due to, well, complex political reasons, they couldn't join the main U.S.-led IPEF framework.
The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework.
Right. But they're actively pursuing bilateral trade deals with the U.S. via the Taiwan-U.S. 21st Century Trade Initiative. And they're constantly looking for ways into IPEF, always highlighting their supply chain strength in semiconductors and electronics.
Beyond those big moves, are there more specific things Taiwan can do to strengthen its own position in this global chip ecosystem?
Absolutely. They can strategically use their current dominance in chip manufacturing as a bargaining chip.
How so?
By offering targeted incentive, they could try to attract more investment from Japanese materials firms or European and U.S. equipment suppliers to set up shop in Taiwan.
Strengthen the domestic supply chain further.
Precisely. Reduce reliance on purely external factors. Another angle is promoting the wider use of semiconductor tech within Taiwan's other industries.
Like spreading the tech around.
Yeah, into traditional sectors like agriculture, medicine, manufacturing, even services like logistics. Using subsidies and tax breaks to boost overall industrial competitiveness, create new growth areas.
And finally, it sounds like long-term R&D investment is just going to be absolutely critical.
Non-negotiable, really. Establishing a major, dedicated semiconductor fund is vital. This can support continuous R&D into next-gen chips, expand infrastructure, R&D facilities, and help diffuse that tech into other sectors for a broad industrial upgrade. It's essential for staying at the forefront.
You even see talk about Europe trying to attract Taiwanese and Korean investment now.
Exactly. European countries offering incentives, infrastructure, trying to lure companies looking to diversify away from China. It complements things like the European Chips Act.
This has been a really, really insightful deep dive. Just incredibly complex, strategically vital stuff. To quickly recap the key points, we looked at how Taiwan initially got that unexpected boost from the U.S.-China tech war.
Right, the tariff effect.
How its crucial position in advanced chip-making turned it into a major geopolitical hotspot, and the huge, varied impacts of U.S. policies like the CHIPS Act and export controls.
And that long-term trend of de-Chinization, the supply chain shifts.
Yeah, and Taiwan's strategic responses, investing abroad, seeking trade deals, strengthening the domestic ecosystem, pushing tech diffusion. It's so clear how interconnected this global semiconductor world is, and the stakes are just incredibly high for everyone involved.
What's really thought-provoking, I think, is just considering the delicate balancing act Taiwan has to perform constantly. It's way beyond just economics or technology. It has these profound geopolitical ripples for the whole world.
And that brings us perfectly to our final thought for you, our listener. Considering Taiwan's incredibly delicate position, squeezed in this intense US-China tech race, what do you think are the most likely long-term geopolitical and economic consequences for the world if one side, the US or China, actually manages to gain clear, sustained dominance in advanced semiconductor technology? It's a huge question, with truly far-reaching implications that are definitely going to shape our world for years to come. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.